What would John Locke have to say about our current situation today? Well, we actually have someone who I will be talking to and interviewing from the John Locke Foundation to discuss some of those ideas that Locke and other people in his line of thinking, the Jeffersonian type of people from our founding fathers, how they would look at the world that we see today with questions about property rights, with questions in an interesting debate happening. I've noticed a lot on Catholic and Christian Twitter between distributism and capitalism and much more. So I had on Brook Medina from the John Locke Foundation to talk to me a little bit. And Brooke serves as the vice president of communications for the John Locke Foundation, which is based in North Carolina. And it is a think tank that helps the state of Carolina, North Carolina, rather, uh, prescribe policy and all of those normal think tank things. And Brooke's writing has been published in outlets such as The Hill, Entrepreneur, Washington Examiner, Daily Signal, and more. And I had her on to discuss John Locke, to discuss, like I said, distributism versus capitalism, property rights, the issues that we see right now with tech, and just kind of went into a bunch of different things. And it was really a fun conversation, a good discussion. And so I definitely think there are a lot of great nuggets of wisdom to take away from Brooke and what she had to say. So definitely don't want to hold up any longer. So I'm going to hop on over to the interview in just a moment. But I do want to remind you to subscribe on YouTube or the podcast, wherever you're listening, watching right now. Make sure you subscribe and head over to conversationofourgeneration.com/subscribe in order to support the work I'm doing here at the Conversation of Our Generation and help me reach more people, get more people onto the podcast and everything, all the work that I'm doing. So I appreciate it. I did have someone, Ben, who's been following for a while, subscribed. So I saw that. Shout out to Ben. He's been very active and giving me good feedback and everything. So I just wanted to thank him for giving me the feedback and for supporting the conversation of our generation. And so with that, I'm going to hop on over to the interview. And welcome, Brook Medina, to the conversation of our generation. I'm glad to have you on.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. And so, for those of my listeners who do not know who you are, how about you give a quick introduction about yourself and your work at the John Locke Foundation?
Sure. So I consider myself a native to North Carolina, although technically I'm not. I was a military kid. And so, as most military kids go, we have to just pick somewhere that we live the longest and claim
Mhm.
it as home. So I consider North Carolina home. My husband and I have been married for 18 years and we have 4 children. And we decided to move back to North Carolina at the last leg of his time in the service because he was in the military for 20 years. And we retired here. And then I decided to go back to work. And so I am at the John Locke Foundation. I'm the vice president of communications here. And the John Locke Foundation, which we will get more into this, I'm sure, during our discussion, but it centers around a lot of what Locke subscribed to as it pertains to natural rights, in particular, economic liberty, private property, et cetera. So we work at the state level to really promote policies that are conducive to human flourishing and limited government.
Mhm. Awesome. That's great. I guess you're a comms person, so you got that down, I bet. Um, but
Yeah, I've
yeah,
had to say it a few times. So
exactly. Yeah, every now and then you can tell you hear people's introductions, and they're like, you can tell they're not a comms person. So
yeah,
that
but
was that
you
was
can
one of
throw me a curveball though, and then we can see how smooth I am with that, and we'll find out what kind of comms person I am.
it. Awesome. Yeah, you don't have your like book of your binder with like all the tabs and everything like Kaylee McEnany did.
Not really, but I'm like looking at my bigger computer screen, my iMac right behind me, and there are probably about 15 tabs open, but well,
Got that ready.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, I know that we kind of had a few things that we wanted to discuss, but with the Locke Foundation being where you work, I think it'd be good to start off with um, this discussion because I think it's topical with NFTs being in the news, cryptocurrencies more and more in the news. Um, the way we look at property rights and how property works seems to be changing, and I've written a book on how kind of we can take the eternal principles of our right to property and apply that differently as technology changes. But what are some of the things that you're seeing out there with, I guess from the Locke's perspective on how we're looking at property in our society?
Wow, that's a good question. And just, I would really like to delve more into the intellectual property in a digital age that you've written extensively about, because I have a lot to learn on that front. But just in so much as what I'm seeing on my end over here in North Carolina, but across the states, because we work with a lot of other state-based think tanks. There's a lot to be said about private property, as especially in the age of COVID, as it pertains to, is property just an object? Is it an item? Is it or is it an idea? Does it extend beyond on access to a building or capital, in a way, a means of production? And so we think often about property in tangible terms, but property is also just the fruits of our labor, what we're able to produce from those tangible items, which would include our finances, our money. And so the whole crypto NFT component to this is fascinating to me. I don't know nearly enough about it. I actually DM'd a friend the other day who is like this crypto expert. I'm like, look, give me the skinny on this, because I've been on all of these Clubhouse chats regarding NFT. Not that I've been saying anything, I've just been listening, but I think I know more NFT than I do the regular crypto stuff at this juncture.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that what you touched on is what we're having to grapple with is so much of our property is not like it used to be land and your, farm animals or the tools you use to, do your craft. Like property was very cut and dry and I think obvious. Like if I'm a blacksmith, my everything that I use to be a blacksmith is part of my property and that's what I need to create my livelihood. But now so much of what we do is, you know, not physical, right? I mean, my whole thing with the conversation of our generation is, I mean, basically most of what I do is not building something physical. It's content, all of that stuff. And so I think NFTs are a great first step at being able to say this is mine and put it out on the internet and not have people like just copy it and steal it. I mean, we saw that with Napster or and other, as the music industry went online and you weren't buying records anymore.
Yeah.
I, I think there's a lot of issues that we have to figure out because property is not just the things that, the items that are in my house or in my yard. It's much more than that. It's like you said, your ability to earn your living. And with businesses being shut down, I think that that's a huge encroachment, but it's also not clear how that's infringing on property rights, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, no, I first off, Napster, that's a walk down memory lane. I remember that argument many moons ago. I don't know if how many of your listeners will remember that or were alive during that time, but yeah, that's that was kind of the cusp of this intellectual property debate that we're currently undergoing. But we live in a dematerializing economy in so many ways now, and so there are services rendered that are just primarily digital. We hire freelancers at our Carolina Journal magazine and newspaper, and it's we don't even we print once a month, but so much more of what we place is just content online, like what you alluded to, what you provide your audience. And looking at intellectual property, and it's just the definition has expanded so broadly nowadays. But an NFT, I think, is a really um, neat horizon that we might be on when it comes to digital property rights and what that looks like. But I don't know, do you own any NFT?
No.
Neither do
But I've
I.
heard some people who have like talking to people that are doing decent at making money at it. It seems to me like it's sort of just a novelty in a lot of ways, and that's how a
Yeah.
lot of good things start. But um, I think that it has to be kind of something that everyone can do. Like I think the big thing with cryptocurrency and with tokens, like you've seen some of the things like ARC and some other things come out that are you're able to then roll out your own token and do more and create your own sort of mini economy and interact with people within your community. I think that that's powerful and then you can use the kind of more common cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum to in exchange between the different little online communities that you have with the different tokens. But with NFTs, I don't see the utility yet in how they're being applied and used. If it's like trading cards and stuff like that, it's cool, but you know, can it maybe make sure that someone can't steal my, if I'm putting out a course on something, like I'm discussing intellectual property rights and I'm putting out a course, it used to be you could film that and then people would have to like couldn't steal it. They couldn't just like screen record it and that's theirs now. Like, is there a way to have NFTs where
Hmm.
it you try to screen record or screenshot something that's not yours that you don't have the right to, and it just like blanks it out, like it doesn't let you do that? That to me seems like a possibility in the future for protecting it a lot better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I was reading the headline the other, well, was it yesterday? Um, that an NFT sold, I don't even know if I'm using the terminology right, but it sold for $69 million.
Oh wow.
So they, yeah, and it was just completely this digital form of art. But I think that also opens up that deeper conversation about the value we place on artwork. And yeah, Christie's had sold that for $69 million. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think right now we're in the learning phase, and we're just going to have to continue to play around with it and wait and see what people come up with. But I'm excited. I think it's
Hmm.
neat that we're moving to some other options that are beyond the fiat currency. Um,
Hmm.
on the other hand, I have heard tell of like China, for example, making use of cryptocurrency and wanting to move that direction so that they can exert more control over their people. But that's because they don't have a free internet like we do. So
Yeah.
that's to me the case against going after and making big tech more under the rule of government on that
Hmm.
front.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I'm curious where you stand on that with some of the big, because that's a big debate as well in the conservative libertarian circles,
Yeah.
of how much, what should we do about companies like that? I'm torn. I don't want government regulation, but I do want them held accountable. And I don't know exactly the right way to go about that. I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I would say I think the consumer welfare standard is a really good one when it comes to antitrust. I'm no antitrust expert, but I really do believe that consumers are the best equipped to determine whether or not they're comfortable
Hmm.
interacting with these companies, utilizing their services. And I say that as someone who places ads quite a bit.
Hmm.
In the marketing world, we were locked out of Facebook because Facebook placed that moratorium on political ads, and so that certainly impacts my job directly. And so one of my bosses wrote an op-ed with a state representative calling for Facebook to rescind that. But do I believe it's the government's place police that? I think that they are going to exert that authority in a way that is trustworthy and perhaps more equitable than a private business or a consumer could. I have plenty of doubts about that. And so I really do think it is a consumer welfare standard issue, and consumers are welcome to use a Bing or a DuckDuckGo instead.
Hmm. Yeah, I've definitely started using DuckDuckGo. I definitely do miss some of the functions of Google, but I do not miss giving them all my data.
Yeah,
So, but
fair point.
yeah, but I also think that, I mean, there's definitely with Google, they had a bunch of, and they still are a huge government contractor. Like, it's not as clear to me that those companies, I mean, Amazon has gotten a ton of breaks and assistance from government and subsidies and tax breaks that to build their infrastructure out. It's not fully like these companies were Standard Oil that just were great and did it better than anyone else, and then they broke them up because they got too big, and then gave the Rockefellers more power in breaking it up actually than they had before. But I think that I think the biggest thing that people can do is like call them out on the fact that they're changing their term. Like, to me, they're defrauding consumers in a lot of ways, that they say these are our terms, they market themselves in a certain way, but they're delivering something differently. And I think that that's where people can keep them in check, because you still can't, even if I want a free and open business world and a good climate for that, you can't commit fraud. You can't falsely advertise yourself and say you're offering one thing when you're delivering another. And I think that that's a great way to hold them accountable.
Yeah, no, I certainly do not want to pretend as if they are the saints in all of this,
Hmm.
because I think there's plenty of criticism to go around, and you make a really good point when it comes to crony capitalism, as it pertains to the Amazon uh, tax breaks, that so many were just like, you know, tripping over one another. All these cities and states, including my own North Carolina, we
Hmm.
repeatedly spoke out against this because our governor and some legislators were trying to make HQ2 happen here, but it
Hmm.
was on taxpayer dime. And so to have a truly free market competition on that front, it's not happening when you're doling out that many taxpayer incentives in
Hmm.
order to achieve that. So I wholly agree that there's definitely room for speculation and criticism on
Hmm.
that front.
Hmm. Yep. And I just think that so many of the monopolies that we see don't arise naturally. It's very rare that you get natural monopolies in the marketplace. And a lot of what's making these companies what they are is, government help, government breaks, and being able to kind of play the middle road between, publisher and what's the word? And like platform. They're kind of
Okay.
able to,
Oh, we're talking section 230 now.
yeah. But I think that all three of those things together, where they can kind of like get the best of both worlds, they get like the protections, but also can do what they want on the other side of it, in addition to the fact that they've every single one of the big tech companies that has what we would consider kind of monopoly power has received some help from government to set that up. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily just, oh, it's an open free market and you can choose. You really can't, because they've been propped up in a way that's unfair in the marketplace too.
Yeah, you know what really gets me about that is that capitalism is what gets a bad rap out of that, rather than the cronyism that it really
Hmm.
is. And so I uh, I find it a little offensive, not but what you're saying, but when people, go after capitalism on this
Hmm.
front, because that's not what it is. This is
Hmm.
government interference, and government and business getting in bed together and essentially sticking it to the taxpayers and consumers. And so that's a whole nother conversation, and I think it's one that is too often lost. And so people, primarily progressives, love to paint this as just another reason why capitalism doesn't work, and failing to actually identify that this isn't what that is.
Hmm. Yep. That's why I try to stay away from the term crony capitalism and just call it cronyism, because
Yeah.
it's like it's really not capitalism when you have the kind of cronyism in there. So yeah, that's a good point. Well, and I think that kind of takes us to another topic that we had lined up, but of discussing capitalism and distributism as different economic models, because I've heard this all of a sudden just like come up as a conversation on like three different podcasts recently. And then when you mentioned it, I was like, okay, yeah, this is totally something that I'm interested in. Someone else actually reached out to me who's a distributist to discuss like
Okay.
why distributism is good. But yeah, I'm curious. I guess what you think of those two models. Maybe if you have, I don't know if you have definitions that are working definitions for those two, so people know what distributism and capitalism are.
Whew, that's good. That's good. I
Probably not.
uh, I would I would defer to Hilaire Belloc when it comes to what distributism is, but he was the author of The Servile State and a contemporary of G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton
Mhm.
certainly deferred to him when it came to distributist thought. But I studied a little bit in school just because one of my professors was that. So he had us read Small is Beautiful by, I think it's F.A. Schumacher. Um, and then The Servile State, as well as Chesterton's What I Saw in America. But
Mhm.
to my understanding, distributism is more in line with a number of Catholic social teachings, and sort of it appeals to this ideal of ownership that is more widely dispersed, so that it's not just in the hands of what some would say is a few,
Mhm.
and so it's more equitably distributed.
Mhm. Yep. Are you Catholic? I'm just curious on the.
I am Protestant.
Oh,
I am
Protestant.
Southern
Okay.
Baptist.
Okay. So yeah, it does, and so that's as a Catholic, that's one reason why they argue in favor of that, and it's not mandatory by the church's teaching. Socialism is out as far as the church says, but you can be distributist or capitalist or be for like this, this supposedly socialist, like Scandinavian countries that are really just free markets with a heavy
Right.
welfare state. But you can have all those sorts of models. But the distributists, I think what their argument is that, and our teaching in the Catholic Church is that property rights are expansive but not absolute. And that if people are unable to feed themselves and provide for themselves, then property is distributed in a way so that it's for the common good, so that you have property rights so that you can feed yourself, survive, and feed your family. And when someone else's property rights then make it so that you cannot do that, right? If some rich money bags has all the money and doesn't share it, then and you can't provide, then the Catholic Church would say that there needs to be something to fix this. I don't think that that normally happens, as someone with an economics minor. I don't think that happens in a normal economy without something. But yeah, it's sort of just trying to make sure that we talk about just wages, making sure that providing people with just wage, the ability to serve, that you should have that you can. The Catholic Church's ideal is that you can have a one income household. You can survive off that. You don't have to, but that you can survive off a one income household. And if you want to have a parent stay at home and raise the family, because parents are there to raise and educate kids. And I think the distributist model is an attempt to
Hmm.
provide for that. And
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about it though.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, I know. I think that some the little o Orthodox Christian in me
Mhm,
appreciates that ideal set up. Um, but the part of me that is limited government certainly has criticisms for it. And it's because I believe that, when we talk about what the ideal is for maybe a single parent household to be able to function wherein the mother perhaps doesn't feel like she has to go to work, and I say that as I am at my
mhm, yeah.
office, but it was a choice that we made. But I stayed at home with my kids for 14 years, and that
Mhm,
was our ideal at that time.
mhm,
And being able to have that opportunity was a huge blessing. However, I believe that too many conflate the church's desires for the nuclear family with the state's desires. And I would argue that there is a sphere for the church to operate in wherein they can promote those ideals of strong families and helping the poor. And that doesn't need to cross over into the state's policy agendas.
mhm, mhm. Exactly. And I think that balancing distributism with capitalism, one thing that I think a lot of people don't recognize, and I talked about it a minute ago, is that a lot of times the reason you get highly centralized capital is not because of the market being responsive. Because if you think about the fact that all of our wants and needs are distributed among individuals, your economy is individuals making individual choices and making those trade-offs and saying this is what I desire most and I'm going to give what it takes to get that at the cheapest price possible. And um, I think that if you look at early America, you kind of had two different economic models between the North and the South, and that was a huge uh, that was really one of the major causes of the Civil War, was that the North was taxing a lot of was tariffing a lot of the things that the South needed to import, because they were an agrarian society. They were very distributed, widespread. There's all of our major cities for the most part are in California or the North. I mean, most of the biggest cities are. There are, Atlanta and Texas has a couple big cities in it, and Florida does too. But for the most part, if you look at where those major cities are, they're in the North because they had policies that were put in place to urge people towards the cities, and the Whigs were pushing that way. So I think that there is the ability, I guess, long-winded way of getting around to this, that you can have that distributist outcome without the, I think, policy prescriptions of distributism. That if you get, it seems to me that if you get the federal government out of our economic system as much as possible, and it's more localized to state and localities dealing with economic policy, you would inherently have a much more distributed system.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the criticism I have of distributism, and it's fine if it's naturally occurring in
Mhm,
communities and cities. I municipalities want that. And I believe that that's at the heart of federalism. States are the test labs of liberty. And even beyond that, if we're getting even more granular, these different districts are able to test these things and test these economic models, provided they don't inhibit someone's natural rights that are clearly laid out in our founding documents. But one of the problems I've had with distributism, in so much as I'm understanding it correctly, is that it assumes that many people actually want to take on not only
Hmm.
the rights of ownership, but the responsibilities of it in terms of, distributing perhaps business ownership among the masses. Not everybody wants those responsibilities, just like, and I think in that I have the same criticism that I have for the neo-feminist movement, which would assume that all women want to be career women,
Hmm.
or that they all want, this sort of gender parity that so many of them call for. And we life choices and these trade-offs all the time. I actually spoke with an integralist that worked for Marco Rubio's campaign, really great guy. We had an excellent conversation, but he really took exception to me saying that we are making trade-offs all the time. And
Hmm.
in his ideal world, we're not doing that, but that's just the reality of of living in society. Is I wake up in the morning and make trade-offs as I'm going to allocate my time, how I'm going to allocate my money. So um
Hmm.
I think that distributism, without a compelling vision that it can persuade communities with, it has to rely on government intervention, and I'm just not comfortable with that.
I agree. I think that there is a movement of people use I see more and more like homesteaders and people who like even I live in the middle of Indianapolis, in a pretty busy area that's definitely very city, but like there's chicken coops and like at least one or two houses per street in my neighborhood. And my wife and I are looking at more of that and I garden
How
and all
fun.
that.
You're
Yeah,
gonna get some
so
chickadees.
I hope so.
How fun.
Maybe not this year. We might have to do a little more setup, so maybe it'll be a next year thing. But like we've talked about that, and I have pushed for like let's get out of the city a little bit and have like space and land. And
Mhm.
um, she's very much like I would like to be able to be 3 minutes from the restaurants that I like. So still figuring that out. But I think that there is
There's
a
a trade-off there, right? That's a major
exactly.
trade-off. I'm with her. I would rather be closer to the restaurants.
Yeah, exactly. And I enjoy that as well. So it's definitely and I would love for my kids to be able to like walk to school or something like that. I feel like that and is a great way of living as well. But it seems like there is at least a will for people to kind of move out and we're seeing this right now with remote work even. Like now I could move wherever. I don't have to be in Indianapolis to work at my job in Indianapolis. We're fully remote and I could, move an hour away out into the middle of the country as long as I have internet. And so I think that there might be a little bit more of a stomach for that kind of more quiet, living. I think that people have gotten a little overwhelmed, at least a lot of people I've seen, with just
Yeah.
the craziness of city life and then craziness of just always having to be on with work. It's just your boss can get a hold of you anytime, anywhere, and you just have to be. So I just think there is a possibility for more of a distributed economy, but I think that it'll be freely. I hope it'll be freely chosen. I think that that's you know, kind of where it'll move. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would say, hey, capitalism is the best economic system we have going around. That's why I'm team capitalism on that front, because it affords people those opportunities and those
Mm,
choices to do that, while still respecting human nature and the
mm,
fact that we're going to choose differently, but there are some bad actors who would attempt to impose their will on others. And so it limited government and capitalism, they serve as necessary checks on one another.
mhm,
And so we kind of defined loosely, I would say, distributism, and capitalism, I would just say, is this two-part system wherein we're reliant upon cooperation and competition, and that is freely chosen among citizens.
Hmm.
And so that's essential. Those are the two pillars of capitalism, in my opinion,
Hmm.
are cooperation and competition in a way that is unhindered by government in so much as is possible. I realize there are some regulations that are necessary, but I really believe in many ways consumers in the private sector can provide those necessary checks and balances to ensure that people are able to access quality goods at an affordable price and actually thereby really improving their lifestyles.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that people associate with capitalism that I don't necessarily think has to be true is your, you know, just your big. I think it's probably Marx's fault that everyone thinks of it this way because really we did have a free market system before that, and it was very agrarian and it was very distributed, and you did have major economic centers, when Marx was writing in the 1840s or whatever it was. Um,
Yeah.
you did have major economic centers, but really most of the world was a pretty distributed free marketplace. Like it was very spread out and the wealth wasn't centralized in one spot. It was just when the Industrial Revolution came, the money and the investment followed the opportunity that centralizing it offered. The
Yeah.
economies of scale that came with machinery and a large workforce and factories is why the reason that so much of that got centralized was because that's where you could make really big returns on your investment. And I think that now you don't need that centralization. And so I think we're going to see a different, I don't know, kind of capitalism dressed a little differently than we've seen it for the last 150 years, if that makes sense. It'll
Yeah.
just look a little different.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution, and that really upended families. It upended just our way of life. Huge move from the rural areas to the urban areas. Um, and then we are in what I think Klaus Schwab would call a Davos or Davos. He's the Davos man guy, but he would call it the fourth industrial revolution, which has to do with the digital economy
Hmm.
and the dematerialized one. And so we're in another disruption right now where we have moved away more from manufacturing heavy jobs, although we still really high when it comes to manufacturing products. It's just we have automated so much of that, and we've moved to an economy that really is heavily reliant upon our intellectual capital
Hmm.
and our freelance ability, our gig work ability, which I mean, that to get political for a moment, that's what Congress is talking about right now is the PRO Act, which would essentially make gig work and freelance work and contract work very, very difficult because they in some ways romanticize this golden era of manufacturing that we don't need to go back to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we also have this idea that every job has to be able to support a family of four. And it's like, but if every job is supposed to be like that, all you're going to do is get rid of the jobs that lead to be having the skills to actually support the family of four. Like if
Right.
I needed to get paid $15 an hour to be a sales associate at a retail store when I started off, guess what? I wouldn't have gotten hired. But because I was working for, $5 an hour plus commission. So if I didn't make the commission, it would be, the 7.25 minimum wage. I was an affordable person, and that's
Mhm.
what gave me the skill set. I mean, I ended up staying there for 6 years, worked my way through college because I was able to get that job as a junior in high school. But that wouldn't be the case, I don't think, if I mean, they would have just automated my job away. They would have had
Right.
a
Yeah.
robot going to grab the shoes for people.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is just one of those perverse incentives that the government has set up. And I would say many of them probably have good intentions. I don't want to ascribe evil motives to them, but they just have a faulty understanding of incentives and how the economy actually works. Well, if you mandate a $15 living wage because you believe that's a just wage all across the United States at one time, or irrespective of cost of living, you're effectively killing off those jobs of the lowest wage earners, and it's creating just even more barriers for people to be able to do what you said, which is work their way up the ladder.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder how many of our senators and Congress people actually had to like work a minimum wage job to get their start in life. I just it seems to me that there's quite a few who, and probably an overwhelming majority, whose first job was like, you know, for them by, I mean, just like if you look at the Bushes or the Clintons, I feel like everyone kind of had a pretty easy path to,
Many of them did. I know one of
not
my
all.
senators, Senator Tillis, he talks about how he didn't even get his college degree till I think he was like 38 or
Yeah.
something like that, 36. And yeah, he did work a lower wage job, but a lot of them, I mean, yeah, a lot of them are Ivy League. They came with a silver spoon in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. And so there is this idea that, oh, I'm doing this to help the poor, but have they spent much time around the poor, their constituents even, that would actually suffer from these policies that
Mhm.
they just, in their mind, it just gives them all the feels, makes them feel real good about it, but in reality it's anything but good
Mhm.
for those people.
I remember one of my history teachers one time noticing the fact that, I think it was Roosevelt. She's like, FDR just did so much stuff for the poor because he was rich and he wanted to help the poor. But Andrew Jackson was, trying to close down the bank and do all these things that were anti-poor. And I'm like, I don't know if Andrew Jackson was actually anti-poor. It's just like, it's funny because grew up an orphan and poor and didn't regard them. I'm like, I just think you don't understand how to help the poor,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
Like, and so
That's
she was
the
a lovely
difference
lady,
between
but
having a heart for the poor and a mind for the poor.
yep.
So,
Yeah, my mom always says if you don't, what is it? If you're not liberal when you're a kid, you don't have a heart. If you're not conservative when you're an adult, you don't have a mind. And so I guess I didn't have a heart as a kid because I
have you always been a conservative?
probably, yeah, probably always a conservative libertarian, but that's because I remember like being 8 and sitting on my dad's lap, like looking at his Scott trade and him explaining to me stocks as best that you can
Oh
to an
my,
8-year-old. So,
that's pretty cool.
yeah. So, but yeah, I do think though that as far as the distributist, like capitalist idea goes, I would like to see a more distributed economy, and I think that that is a good end, like to allow people to have that opportunity. I want that opportunity more spread out, and for people who do want to be a business owner, who do want to have land and buy a house and all those things, like I want those things to be affordable for people.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of those things are because of interference in the market primarily, but you know, I bought my first house I'm 25, and it's hard for people my age to get that because you have to. I just think that there's a lot of perverse incentives in our market that could be fixed and ironed out and offer that more distributed model. But I
Mhm.
don't think that distributism is the way to get there. I don't think it's
Yeah.
means.
Okay, so what you're saying is you would, so when you're saying you want it more distributed, you're talking about more people having upward mobility,
Hmm. Yep.
which I think in so many ways, I don't have the stats in front of me, but to my knowledge, more and more people are going up into
Yeah.
the middle class. There is far less poverty. And so I think that the income mobility is happening. It's interesting though, because many on the left who will call for more government intervention, they will often cite, well, the top 1% earns at least $400,000 or
Hmm.
more per year, but completely ignoring how many people are comprised of the middle class nowadays and how
Hmm.
many people start in poverty and move up. And so I think that a lot of the issues as it pertains to even housing affordability have to do with government intervention in the form of zoning and land use regulations, occupational licensing, education monopolies by not
Hmm.
allowing school choice. So
Hmm.
I think so many of the areas in which a distributist would be drawn to applaud,
Hmm.
uh, a lot of them have to do with things that if we roll back more government involvement, we'd be able to get there naturally.
Hmm. Yep. And I think that part of my idea of like when I say distributist too is I don't have to be if I'm in rural Indiana or rural North Carolina, which I know there's less opportunity there, it's like, how can we create it so that you don't have to go to the major city in your
Okay.
state to
Hmm.
have an opportunity at, upward mobility? How I think that there are things that we can do, with I think that now that remote work's more feasible and popular, I think that now that some of these situations, even the trades and things like that are really becoming much more of a viable career option than they were, 25 years ago when, everyone had to go to college all the time. It's like, I think that there are opportunities to kind of provide for families without your traditional, I'm going to go to college, go to a big city and do it that way. And
Yeah.
I would like to
Yeah.
see that more, because I think that when you go to cities and when everyone's moving to a city, it disrupts our understanding of how things function. it it
Mhm.
seems to me like the coastal elites don't understand this flyover country, so as they call it, because they don't understand what it's like to not live in a city of like 3 million people or more.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that that gets to that whole idea of rootedness. And I've been following some folks on Twitter that just talk about the importance of having somewhere to call home, and that sense of community and rootedness, which is interesting as an army kid listening to that. I'm like, I grew up everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh, but so for me, rootedness has a lot more to do with the people around you,
Hmm.
and thankfully the opportunities that tech provides to keep in touch with family members.
Hmm.
um, and so it's less about geography and it's more about a posture of the heart and families. But I do think that there is something to be said about it. It's just it takes more convincing for someone
Hmm.
like me when we hear tell of that, because we didn't have that experience, and so we're kind of the foreigner on that front.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm the exact opposite. Like my parents both moved around quite a bit, and so they were like, "We're gonna find something and stay planted," and like they're still in the house that they bought, 3 years before I was born.
Oh
So
wow, that's neat.
yeah, yeah. So, and I actually live like 10 minutes from them. I didn't move very far away.
I
But
love that though. I mean, hey, I hope my kids stay close by.
yeah.
So even though I had some great experiences, we lived in Germany, we lived in Guatemala, and then all across the United States. And that provided me a different perspective than I would have
Mhm.
had I stayed in one spot. But even so, for my children, I would love for them to be close by. I want to see my
Mhm.
grandbabies. So
Yeah, exactly. And that was my thing. Is I was like, it's I'm like 20 minutes from my grandma, 10 minutes from my mom. Like when childcare is a thing, we'll have babysitters all the time
yes.
that are begging to babysit, and we don't need to pay. So
That, yeah, I can't even tell you how amazing that part of it is. Stay
Mhm.
over there if for no other reason but that.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and then one thing that you mentioned, kind of moving on a little bit, you talked about Sorokin's crisis of our age, and this is something that I've heard of him, and I
Mhm.
remember looking this up when you mentioned it, and I remember being interested. But I actually would like if you could kind of explain what this idea is, and um, yeah, and why it's important and why it's on your mind.
Yeah, okay. So it's been a few years since I read his book, The Crisis of Our Age, but it was actually recommended to me by John Street,
Mm.
who is an evangelical cultural commentator and runs the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And Sorokin was a Russian dissident. He came to the United States, I think in 1918, somewhere around then. Um, and he was the first head of the sociology department at Harvard. And so he writes that history continues to repeat itself in so much as there are these three kind of super cycles, is what he calls them.
Mhm.
And so he calls them sensate, ideation, and idealistic cultures. And so, sensate would be have to do more with the senses, data driven. So kind of what we have been in for a number of couple hundred years at least,
Mhm.
if not longer, where it's focusing more on our natural experience. But then there's this ideation culture, which is kind of a blend of sensate and idealistic. And so it's this progression, which I would argue that's kind of where we're at right now, is moving from sort of this data driven, everything must be empirical sort of society to one that is more idealistic, which taken to its extremes and in a wrong way could be more gnostic in a way.
Mhm.
It's more of a, everything is what I ascribe it to be. My truth is,
Mhm.
is of my own making. It's not hinged to reality. We see this in the sexual revolution and the offspring of that. And so that's what, so Sorokin has broken these up into these three different super cultures. And to me, it was just a better way to understand how and why art is the way it is, why cinema
Mhm.
is the way it is, why our education focuses are what they are. And so what used to be, you know, and I'm okay with us moving back towards the liberal arts a little bit more. I'm a
Mhm.
liberal arts grad myself, but
Yeah.
when we're moving away from what the science actually says and creating sort of this nebulous, elusive term for various experiences in our life, it's an indication that we're moving away from the sensate culture and more to the idealistic per Sorokin. So I just think it's
Mhm.
an interesting way to categorize our period of time.
Mhm. That's very interesting. Yeah, I definitely think that we have moved to a place where in an idealistic culture too that you have to get people to buy into it. If you look, I mean, if you, that sounds like he was probably leaving around the time basically that the Russian Revolution was starting then if it's 1918, he he probably didn't leave much later if he got out
Yeah.
because if you're a dissident, 19, after that, you were probably in one of the camps.
Hmm.
But uh there's sort of this idea that in a sensate culture, if you're taking in, I'm actually reading Descartes right now, his Meditations on First Philosophy, and his whole idea is that you have to see how things appear to you, and you can sort of try to grasp them by that. But at some point, you in an idealistic culture, you're trying to impose the other way around. You're not trying to take in what's being, fed to you by the world around you, and through your senses, and kind of filtering that through reason. Instead, you're trying to say, here's my vision of the world and what I want the world to be, and I want to try to force that on the world. And I don't, I mean, I see a lot of that right now. If that's what the idealistic culture looks like, I mean, that's really where we are, is trying to impose a bunch of different views on what our society should be on the world. And those seem to be in heavy conflict. I think that, and it's not just progressives that are doing it. I think that there are
Mhm.
a lot of people who have, I mean, even in sort of your conservative circles of people who are like, we need to make sure that there are, that everyone is doing XYZ the way I want to do it. And, if, there should only ever be one parent earning an income, one parent should stay home. And it's like, yes, those are ideals, but you also have to be realistic and practical about things as well.
Yeah. And
So,
respect people. Locke would argue you need to respect people's ability and their ownership over their own lives and
mhm,
their decision making processes. And so, yeah, I think you make a good point. That's like the horseshoe theory confirmed for sure, where there's the populism that we see in an Elizabeth Warren. There's also the populism we see in a Josh Hawley.
mhm,
And they both have government at the center of some of this decision making in to cure areas of society or the markets that they disagree with.
mhm,
And yeah, but you know, one of the things about the idealistic culture though that I appreciate is uh, it kind of goes along with Scruton's concept of beauty,
mhm,
and just that there are things that are intrinsically beautiful and that we should pursue those things, we should celebrate them, and we should aspire to them.
mhm. I do think that that is a good point. And I think that we have had times that our culture has been idealistic. I mean, I would look at the Renaissance and everything before, before we kind of back swung in the Enlightenment to sort of extreme rationality. There was sort of this, I mean, Shakespeare and, I mean, the artists that came through the Renaissance, there was this sort of lofty ideal of beauty, but it was ordered towards what we knew, we knew what we were working towards as a culture. We had one focus, and that was as a Christian culture, the promotion of the Christian ideal and
Mhm.
of spreading the gospel. And while there were probably obviously problems in the culture at the time, there was a unified vision of what we were working towards. And so I think that that works when idealistic societies can work when you have that, but when you have competing ideals or ever changing ideals, I like in Orthodoxy, which I just finished by Chesterton, he discusses, and I used the quote recently, but he talks about how, if your goal is to paint the whole world blue, that's great. You can do that. You can paint, you know, each blade of grass blue and go through it all. But if you change tomorrow and you want to paint it red, well, now you have to paint over everything you just painted blue and paint it red. And, or you're just going to have you're never going to finish painting it the one color you want if you change it every day. And that's what he says, the progressivist is considered constantly doing, is changing that aim and that ideal. And that, when you have an ever-changing ideal, that's when idealism doesn't really work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would invoke Chesterton again in his Chesterton's fence, or what we
Hmm.
call Chesterton's fence, wherein we can become so idealistic as to how we think something ought to look that we forget why it looks the way it does right now, or why it was designed in such a way. And so it doesn't mean that there's never room for progress or change, but that it should definitely be executed in a way that is more thoughtful and respects those that came before us and is considering those that come after us.
Hmm. I agree. And I think that we have not even just a disregard, but I think a distaste, or a kind of a spurning of the people of the past in our culture today that is sad. I mean, it's only a matter of time until Locke gets canceled for some reason.
Oh, don't tell me that. I've already, that's a comms crisis. I'm not ready to have it.
Hopefully not.
Not changing our name.
Yeah.
No, I was just even reading up on Locke. One of his essays on property, but right before that it was talking about on slavery and just how it is a fundamental human right, natural right, that is aligned with natural law, which I appreciate that Locke appeals to natural law first. So he doesn't just like look at natural rights in a vacuum. He says that they're predicated upon us understanding natural law. And it's a natural right that someone would be in possession of their own being, that which precludes anyone from being able to own another. So
Mhm.
take that, wannabe Locke counselors.
Yeah. Yep. I think that, I mean, in that it's his recognition, I think, that inspired our founding fathers in that too. I mean, even the ones who owned slaves did basically work to end it, and gave it the path, paved the pathway for ending slavery in our country.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and even I was reading or just scanning this essay that had to do with women and how the way in which Locke approached human and natural rights as an equalizer for women who, till
mhm,
that point in time, I mean, he was really rather radical in his viewpoint of women being equal and co-equal
mhm,
in so many ways to men. He advocated for girls to have the same education as boys,
mhm,
for women to be able to own property, and obviously they were in possession of themselves. They were nobody else's property. And I think that those sort of intellectual seeds have been a net gain for the women's movement, regardless of where we're at right now with the women's movement, and it's been co-opted in so many ways. But I would say that that's in keeping with scripture even,
mhm,
and just how Jesus did so much to bring dignity to the status of women in a time when it
mhm.
was not common whatsoever.
Yep, that's I mean, you're evangelical, so you may not have the same dedication to Mary that we have as Catholics, but when people, criticize us for being backwards, I'm like, hey, we say the greatest created thing is Mary, is a woman. So, you know,
Right, yeah. So clearly you hold women in high esteem.
yeah, yeah, better than all the angels in the whole universe, other than God. So, hey, uh, but yeah, so I, man, I'm looking at our topics and I feel like we covered a lot of other things. Did you have, I also want to be respectful of your time, and I know we're a little bit over for what we planned, but did you have any other thoughts or uh, things that came to mind that you wanted to discuss?
Well, I would just be curious as we're ending to get a little bit more information on your thoughts on intellectual property and property rights in the digital age. How would you what is the main thesis of your book?
Yeah. So, well, my book is basically, the thesis is walking through the different innovations that have happened. So if you look way early on and you look at the earliest property rights, there was an early recognition that if you look at the Old Testament, Hammurabi's code, ancient codes of law, that there is something about us that we have a right to own and protect our property, and that property is something that has to be ownable. You can't own the sun or something that you can't actually lay claim to, and it has to be something that's defensible as well. So, when you the NFT token thing, made someone called out like when you could buy a star or whatever, and you paid $50 to some society and you own that
Yeah.
star. That doesn't really, it's not really yours, sadly. Sorry, but there's no really way to lay claim to it. But over time, those things got refined, and we found out, or we at least put forward that you can't own other human beings. That we refine those ideas, and then in the last couple hundred years, things radically changed with the kind of what I talked about with everyone moving to the cities and capital becoming much more centralized. That wasn't necessarily necessary in property in the world, and so I kind of argue for a more distributed economy, more decentralized. I guess the word would be more decentralized economy that is more responsive to where talent is. One thing that inspired me was I was listening to a talk, and someone with a VC venture capital firm that invest in tech companies, and she was like, we're not investing in Silicon Valley anymore because money goes where the talent is, and the talent that's the lowest price that we can invest in is outside of Silicon Valley at this point. It's in the markets like Raleigh, Durham is a city that
Yeah.
we work with my company. That triangle area is huge. Indianapolis is rising, Austin, Texas, all these cities. And so I've kind of seen that there's a fracturing of the capital and of the fracturing of our culture is also a sign of that as well, that we don't naturally, as the United States, have this monolithic vision. That's kind of something that's been imposed on us after the Civil War, when the Republican Party basically ran the entire country for 45 years and every single thing, and they kind of turned it into a monolith and implemented all of Alexander Hamilton's ideas that I think were terrible ideas, most of them. So other than ending slavery was obviously a good thing, but that was pretty much the one bright side. And so I think that our way forward has to be things like NFTs, things like that, that when you're in possession of the ability to defend your property, you're the one who's going to be best posed to do that. The government can help ensure property rights, and I think we should look at institutions that help with that, but they can't be relied upon, and we have to be figuring out ways to innovate and be able to defend our own property claims. And I think that in the digital space, it requires us knowing what we're doing, having better password security and things like that, which is important, and finding ways to be able to tokenize things or whatever it is to be able to lay claim to what is actually yours, so that, as we've seen, I mean, for all I know, if you're at Chase Bank, they could just drain your account whenever they want.
Mhm.
PayPal's stopping payments for people, or not PayPal, but who's the other one that's been doing that?
Is it
One of
Stripe?
Stripe might have done it. I think it might have been Stripe. That, or like, but some of those payment companies were saying we're not going to sell for people who are doing bad things, or Parler or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Amazon, all of those things in the technological space, when they don't actually own their own stuff and you're outsourcing everything,
Yeah.
you have to have some things in place and assurances that people can't just pull the rug out from under you. And
Hmm.
I think that cryptocurrency, tokenization, things like that are an opportunity that I don't fully understand everything. I'm not the technical person, but I do see the opportunity. And from what I understand, uh, I think that there's a lot of space there to be able to actually defend those claims in a new
Yeah.
way.
So would you say that you support people being able to own their own data, like when their social media data,
Mhm.
and determine whether or not it's accessed by third parties?
100%. I mean, if you sign the terms that say that you're going to let them use it, that's one thing. But yeah, I think that all of that stuff, I mean, and I'm also, a marketer in the digital space. I mean, I do this and I run Facebook ads and stuff. So
Right. Those third
I
party
see,
cookies are pretty nice when you're
yeah,
marketing.
I know I have the Facebook pixel set up. I can see all the stuff that you can do with that, but it's like, I think, I also am very cognizant of the fact that if I have access to this much, data of other people, that's how much access they're giving me, first of all. And
Mm-hmm.
then on top of that, it's, it's disconcerting. I mean, I use Brave browser. I use DuckDuckGo instead of Google. Um, I know that, I mean, I don't really get on Facebook or Instagram really, and I'm definitely afraid of TikTok. I, I don't want to
I
know what,
had a TikTok account and then I made like a couple videos like I'm done. I'm
yeah.
done.
I'm like, I'm afraid of what my government's going to do with my data. I'm really afraid of what China's going to do with it.
Yeah, there's that.
So
Don't want to give the commies too much information. So
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot of shifts in how we need to look at it, that the economies of scale, that this big mass production stuff is not where it is, that it's really into more and more niche ability. Like it's much more about differentiation than it is about price competition now,
mhm.
and being able to drill in, because the world is your business place now. I mean, you don't have to just sell to the people down the street. You can distribute your content all around the world. I mean, I see, most of it's United States traffic that I get, but I get people from all around the world hitting my website. And so in that kind of global space, how do you also carve out, I think that solopreneurism, entrepreneurism is going to become more popular again, because it used to be the way that things were a lot more. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that everyone was an employee and there was one CEO at the top of like multi-billion-dollar organizations. Pretty much everyone was a small business owner of some sort, whether that was a service business or, uh, grocery store, whatever it is. uh, I think that we'll get back to something more along those lines. At least I think there is going to be something more decentralized, more
Yeah,
distributed.
I think you're right. I think
Mhm.
so. So it's exciting. Well, thank you so much
But
for
yeah,
having me on.
well, thanks for letting me give the thesis of my book on my show.
You know what? Yeah, I'll bill you later for that.
I like it. Well, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. Before we sign off, I guess you want to tell people where they can find out more about you and the Locke Foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want more information on what we're doing at John Locke, just go to johnlocke.org. And then if you want to, feel free to follow me at Twitter. On Twitter, I am Brooke_Medina_, and I would love to communicate with you there and hear some feedback.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on today, Brooke. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick.
Yep. I don't know about you, but I truly enjoyed that discussion. I hope you did as well. I think Brooke has a lot of great insights throughout this conversation. So definitely is one that personally I'll have to listen to again to kind of pull out all those nuggets of wisdom that I was discussing about in the intro. And so you can also find out more about Brooke and her work, as well as the work of the John Locke Foundation, in the links in the show notes. So definitely check that out. And there will be links to all that information there for you as well. So head over, find out more about that. Head to conversationforourgeneration.com/subscribe in order to support the work that I'm doing at the Conversation for Our Generation. For $5 a month, you get access to any premium content, the courses that I'm currently rolling out with the Golden Mean and others that will be coming down the pike. You'll also get access to my Discord community, which is pretty lively, has a lot of good discussions happening there with people like Frank, who you've seen on the podcast. Stephen Sawyer from the Vital Masculinity podcast is really active in there. So definitely check that out, or subscribe there to get access to those two things and a copy of my book. I'll send that to you as well if you subscribe. So definitely do that. Subscribe to the podcast, to YouTube, wherever you're watching/listening to this. And let's get the dialogue going. Let's get more people involved in the conversation. And so share this with somebody maybe who could use it, who maybe you've had some discussions around these sorts of ideas. Definitely feel free to send some of these episodes out to other people, because I think that they're a great resource as well in having discussions and sparking discussions with you and your friends or family, depending on who you need to be talking to about some of these deeper ideas. And so thank you for listening to this episode of The Conversation of Our Generation. Let's get the dialogue going. I'll talk to you next time.